Welcome, everyone, to the 5th public lecture in a series called From the Courtroom to the Streets. It is a public lecture series organized by Tom Lantos Institute. I will say a few words about the Tom Lantos Institute, as it is a fairly young organization, so I will introduce it to you. The Tom Lantos Institute has been established in 2011. I've been a director of it for around 1.5 years, and we are a public institution. We operate with public funds. We are independent from government, which is secured by a multi-party curatorium, board of directors. And we have 3 mandates. One is Jewish life and anti-Semitism, Roma rights and citizenship, and human and minority rights, with a particular focus on Hungarian minorities. I am delighted to be here because I had my PhD in this very institution, and I can see some of the professors I know. And I am talking about my PhD because the approach to human rights I addressed in my PhD is exhibited, is employed by the Tom Lantos Institute as well. And our approach to human rights is not legalistic, although it acknowledges the legal dimensions of international human rights norms. Our primary focus is not that of public international law, but it is more a multidisciplinary approach that goes back to international social constructivists in international relations. So our focus on human rights is civil society activism and the ways civil society contributes to the formulation of international human rights norms. This is where the title of this lecture series comes from the courtroom to the streets, because our idea is that you can have as many successful strategic litigation cases if the values of human rights are not owned by the society. Violations will be repeated again and again. So in this particular public lecture series, we invited Professor David Gillborn to talk about critical race theory and the concept of critical race theory as it shapes education, in particular in Britain. Professor David Gillborn, David, you were a lecturer at the University of London for 20 years. Then in 2012, you moved to Birmingham, University of Birmingham, where you are a professor of critical race studies and the director of the Center for Research in Race and Education, and editor-in-chief of the journal Race, Ethnicity, and Education. We have worked on this public lecture for a year or so, when finally we found the time for you to come. So we are delighted you are here, and please take the floor.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to begin by, well, thanking all of you for turning out when it's such a nice evening and there are so many really inviting bars just outside. If any of you want to go downstairs and just listen from the street, that's completely understandable. I'd also like to thank the Tom Lantos Institute for inviting me here. It's the second time that I've visited Hungary, and it's always really fascinating to see different perspectives on these kinds of issues. And earlier today we had a workshop around some of this, and I met some truly outstanding Roma scholars and activists, and it was quite humbling to hear about the work that they were already doing with elements of critical race theory. So I hope that some of the things that I'm going to say will connect with issues that you're working with and will prove as interesting as this morning was for me. I'm going to speak for no more than 40 minutes, hopefully, and then we'll open it up to questions. My first slide is a quote from Primo Levi, a man who survived Auschwitz and produced some outstanding writing about the human side of the Holocaust. And I think this is a particularly important quotation. He said, "Monsters exist, but they're too few in number to be truly dangerous. More dangerous are the common men, the functionaries, ready to believe and to act without asking questions." Now, my lecture looks at how racism operates in everyday life, in politics and in education, and how it operates through the actions of ordinary people. So I need to start by stating that every nation obviously has its own particular history and its own special set of contemporary circumstances. So I don't presume in any way to lecture you about the situation here. But we do live in an increasingly globalized world where broad political and demographic shifts can be discerned not just across different countries, but actually across continents. And so I hope that some of the observations that I'm going to make will help you to think in some challenging ways about issues that you face in this society. Now, I'm going to talk about ethnic diversity, about human rights, and the role of education. Usually when people talk about these issues, they focus on the minority. They ask, what's different about the minority group? What does the minority have to do in order to fit in? These questions make two key assumptions. They adopt a deficit view of minority groups. They assume that the minority is the problem, and they assume that the majority is absolutely fine and can go on completely unaffected by the changes around them. I work from a perspective that switches that on its head. So I try and look at how inequality and injustice arises from the actions of the majority, and in particular how racism operates on a day-to-day level in everyday life. And if anyone has a can of fly spray, that would be really great at the moment. I would really like that. Unfortunately, I don't have the reactions of Barack Obama, so I can't do that thing of pulling it out of the air and dropping it with superpowers on the floor, so I'm just going to try and ignore it. So in the talk, I'm going to look at these issues. So this is a roadmap of where I'm going to go. First, I'm going to look at the meaning of race and racism. And I understand that the word race is a contentious term. Then I'm going to look at the relationship between Europe and racism. I'll talk about the importance of human rights as a weapon against racism. And I'm going to look at the spread of racism and xenophobia across contemporary Europe. And then finally, I'm going to show you how these things are playing out in the United Kingdom, and in particular in England, where mainstream media and politicians are attacking human rights legislation and promoting fears that white people are losing out because of ethnic diversity. Because I'm an educationist, I'll look in particular at the role of education, a field where racism is part of the everyday reality for thousands of children, but where this racism is often subtle and not even recognized as a problem by most of the people inside the system. Now, it's widely accepted that there is no such thing as separate human races. Everyone has heard the statement, there's only one race, the human race. The physical characteristics that are usually taken to denote race, things like skin tone, they're assigned different meanings at different times in history and between different societies. So although we're told that race is a fixed and natural set of genetic differences, that's a lie. Race is socially constructed. It's invented. People invented race, the idea of race, and we constantly remake race over time through interactions. The easiest way of trying to show this, I think, is to think, if I walk into an airport in the US, I go into JFK in New York with one of my colleagues, and I say to people in the departure lounge, is my colleague black? And the majority of Americans in the room would say, yes, your colleague's black, Dave. Fine. We get on a plane, we fly to Brazil, we get off in Rio de Janeiro, we walk into the arrivals lounge and say to the majority of brilliant Brazilians in there, is my colleague black? And they would say, no, she's not black. Now, my colleague hasn't changed during the flight. What's different is the meaning of black in the US and in Brazil, where because of different histories of racial and colonial oppression, black means something different. So although in both societies certain markers pretend to be about a deep-level genetic difference, they're not. They're a superficial marker which has a different significance in those different societies because they've constructed that difference in different ways. Now, ethnic groups are often talked about as if they're a race. They're treated as if they're a different race. And the idea that ethnicity is somehow less of a construct or less flexible is also untrue. Probably the greatest scholar that ever worked at the university that I work at, Stuart Hall, wrote a very famous paper about new ethnicities. The idea that ethnicities are constantly shaped and evolving and changing. And just the title, New Ethnicities, amazed some people because they thought you couldn't have a new ethnicity. They assumed that ethnicity was somehow historically fixed. So both categories, race and ethnicity, are a lot more complicated than we're led to believe. Now, some people argue that if there's no such thing as race, don't use the word. Because if you use the word, people will imagine that there is such a thing as race. Some people put quotation marks around the word to show, I know there's no such thing, I mean social race. I put it in quotation marks. Now, the problem with just dropping the word, for me, is that it's difficult to deal with racism if we disallow ourselves the language of race. I think to try and address racism, which is often a very visceral, lived experience, to try and do that in kind of academic terms that disassociate from the world outside, makes it very difficult for us to take forward that critique. And for me, the key thing is not whether a theory or a set of terms are elegant in a textbook, it's whether they work in the real world. Do they allow us to change things in the world? So we have to be very careful when we use these terms. And racism is another term which, in England at the moment, if you use the term racism, you're often considered to be a racist. There's almost a situation where to talk critically about racism is to be accused of being a racist. Racism is always politically sensitive and it's always a complicated issue. Now, traditionally, we think about racists as looking like that guy there, who has a particularly fetching hairstyle. I'm not so sure about his dress sense. We think that that's what a racist looks like. Racism is crude, it's vicious, it's violent, it's obvious, and it's intentional. That guy knows he's a racist. But racism is not always that simple. So a critical view of racism sees racism as much more subtle. People involved in racist acts might be completely unaware that what they're doing has any kind of negative connotation. They might be very well intentioned. So this guy is another face of racism. Now, a lot of people object to the idea that, well, if I mean well, how can I be a racist? And from a critical perspective, I would argue, well, we look at the outcomes of what you do. It really doesn't matter what you intend. What matters is the consequence of your actions. So if a school system systematically does things which disadvantage one or more minority group, it is racist in its outcomes. Now, a lot of people disagree with that viewpoint, and it switches to a very different understanding of racism, rather than being what's sometimes called the bad apple theory, that in a room like this there might be one or two nasty racists. It switches to a view of the world that says, well, actually, in a room like this, we're all probably involved in this to one degree or another. Now, Europe and racism are two ideas that are intimately interrelated. You could even argue that they actually co-constitute each other, that you couldn't have racism without Europe, and you can't have Europe without racism. Historically, European nations have dominated many parts of the world, and of course, some of the crudest racism was used to justify the slave trade, and it still shapes global politics today. It's been argued by some theorists that Europe played a foundational role, that racism as we know it is inherently a European export. So Omi and Winant talk about, they say, just as the noise of the Big Bang still resonates through the universe, so the overdetermined construction of world civilization as a product of the rise of Europe and the subjugation of the rest of us still defines the race concept. Now, this map shows the major Western European colonies at the end of the Second World War, and obviously the political map of the globe looks very different now. Many countries have won independence since the last war. Colonies, though, are not gifted their independence. They win independence. And this is a key issue for those of us working within critical race theory. Justice and independence are not gifted by benign oppressors who wake up one morning and decide to be less horrible. They don't decide to suddenly take less of a profit from the oppressed groups. Independence is won through active resistance, which makes the status quo unsustainable. Now, human rights, of course, are also intimately connected with Europe and European history. The major international human rights instruments came about as a direct reaction to Nazi atrocities. And it's important to remember that the Holocaust was perpetrated on European soil, led by one of Europe's most celebrated civilizations, and that many other European states collaborated in the so-called final solution. Now, you would imagine that that was warning enough to everyone, especially in Europe, about playing with ideas of race and ethnic superiority. But in the wake of the 2008 global financial crisis, we've seen a dramatic, predictable, and dangerous rise in xenophobia and racism across Europe. Roma, black people, and Muslims are the most common targets right across the continent. Often these groups are targeted in vicious attacks in which people are injured or murdered, property is destroyed, and entire communities are terrorized. This is the most obvious, simple, brutal form of racism, often perpetrated by far-right groups. But such crude and vicious attacks are not the whole story. Mainstream politicians and democratically elected national governments are also involved in wider processes that create and sustain an atmosphere of racial and ethnic tension and antagonism. Amnesty International recently reported on governments around the world and their history on human rights. And they identified human rights abuses across Europe, with governments failing to protect the human rights of their citizens, going back on international pledges, and courting popularism by cutting back personal freedoms and especially the rights of minority groups. These issues take different forms in different countries. Examples from across Europe include reports of racially motivated attacks against Roma, foreign nationals, and visible minorities. Roma facing widespread discrimination in areas such as education, employment, healthcare, and housing, and homophobic violence in many states, often with authorities ignoring the problem or being actively complicit. Overall, the pattern is very clear. European states currently witness numerous violations of human rights, and the situation appears to be getting worse. Let me show you how these things are currently playing out in England. These are a series of headlines from national newspapers. These are part of the quality press, and they give you a sense of what my colleague Stephen Ball has called a discourse of derision. When politicians in England talk about human rights, they do so with a sneer. So these human rights laws are a charter for criminals. Millions paid out to criminals thanks to the European Court of Human Rights. Human rights laws are undermining our health service. Human rights law allowed Idris Papula to rape a woman. This discourse of derision around human rights is seen as a vote winner. The current majority party in England, the Conservative Party, are arguing that we need to pull back from European human rights legislation, and they think this is a popular move. So government ministers and the right-wing press both portray human rights concerns as a block on the freedom of the country to make its own decisions, and they view human rights protections as bureaucratic, meddlesome, and even dangerous. A concern with ethnic diversity and multiculturalism is described as an attack on the white majority. The clearest statement of this comes from the current British Prime Minister, David Cameron, ironically in a speech he gave about security in Munich. And he attacked what he called the doctrine of state multiculturalism. He said that multiculturalism, the idea of respecting different ethnic groups, he said that multiculturalism had encouraged segregation and that it operated a double standard where white people would be attacked for things that minorities would get away with. He said, this is a direct quote, "When a white person holds objectionable views, racist views for instance, we rightly condemn them. But when equally unacceptable views or practices come from someone who isn't white, we've been too cautious, frankly even fearful to stand up to them." Now, this is a lie. And you don't take my word for it, I can demonstrate that this is a lie, because on the very same day that my Prime Minister stood up in Munich and said white people are subject to this horrible double standard. The town of Luton, where I live, 30 miles north of London, was closed down by a demonstration by a group calling themselves the English Defence League. These are some pictures from the day. They're a vicious anti-Muslim hate group. Now, the EDL demonstration was known about weeks in advance. As you can see from this, the centre of the town was closed off. Residents were told in advance, don't come into the city centre. We're going to close it off so that this vicious anti-Muslim hate group can exercise its right to protest. Now, in his speech, Cameron said nothing about the English Defence League, nothing about an English town being closed down so that fascists can walk around with their entertainingly misspelt banners. Now, critics pointed out that there's a bit of a contradiction here between this idea that white people aren't allowed to express nasty views and what happened in Luton on the same day. But a senior member of the government responded like this. This is a Prime Minister giving a speech about the future of our country. That doesn't have to be rescheduled because some people have chosen to march down a street that particular day. Now, I think if that group of some people had been Muslims or Roma, there would have been an outcry. Citizens of Luton kicked out of their own town. Instead, because this is white racists, it's just some people. Now, in fact, demonstrations like this are meant to terrorize minority communities. The EDL hold their demonstrations in the most ethnically diverse parts of the country. They are deliberately terrorizing minority communities. And examples like this are not one-off exceptional events. They're symptomatic of fundamental shifts in policy in the United Kingdom. And these shifts hide racist inequality, and they empower white people to feel that they have automatic claims to authority and virtue. In education, the system is shaped by institutional racism. Subtle, complex, but deeply entrenched race inequalities scar the English education system. Minority groups often experience bullying and harassment from their peers. They face chronically low teacher expectations. So teachers view black students and Roma students as much more likely to be troublemakers than someone who will excel academically. They're much more likely to be expelled from school, where most kids that are expelled from school never make it back to mainstream education. And they're overrepresented in low-ranked teaching groups, where they cover less of the curriculum and sometimes wind up taking exams where the very highest grades are not available. So because they're on a lower rated exam, if they get every single question right, they still cannot get the highest grade. And the groups that experience these problems most frequently are Gypsy Roma children, traveller students, and black British students. Students who would identify their family heritage as in black Africa or particularly in the Caribbean. Now, it's important to mention that the majority of these children are British citizens. They were born in England. They're not immigrants. They're as British as I am. They were born in the same country. They've gone through the entire education system. They speak the language fluently. And yet their educational experience is shaped by racist inequality. In terms of educational achievement, in the UK, the most common measure for whether you've been a success or not at the end of secondary school is whether you've got at least 5 high-grade passes. So high-grade passes in at least 5 subjects, including English and mathematics, because the government have decided that they're much more important than any other subject. And in the latest data, the majority group, who are called white British in the statistics, they did significantly better than several minority ethnic groups. There are some minority ethnic groups that do better than the white British group. But I'm focusing on the ones that do less well, and you'll see why very soon. So in this graphic, the higher the column, the better. The higher the column, the greater the proportion of kids in that ethnic group who have hit the required level at the end of their secondary education. And I should mention that the terms here for these different groups are the official terminology. All terminology around race and ethnicity is imprecise. Often it has hidden dangers. So these are the official terms. People are asked to identify their own ethnicity, and it's recorded in official statistics. So starting from the highest achieving group, white British, then so-called mixed race students, where one parent is white and one is black Caribbean. The black Caribbean group itself, then people that identify as travellers of Irish heritage, and then a combined Gypsy Roma group. As you can see, there are considerable inequalities of achievement between some of these groups. Black Caribbean students are less likely to achieve the required level than white British peers, and the inequalities are greatest for Gypsy, Roma, and traveller students. Now, that's in terms of achievement. Not all students make it to the end of their secondary education because they are seen as troublemakers and they're removed from the system. They're put into part-time special units, or they just disappear from the system altogether. And when that happens officially, often it happens without ever being recorded. But when it does get recorded, it's called exclusion from school. This graphic shows the chances of being excluded for each student in a particular ethnic group. So here, the higher the column, the worse the story. Now, I've highlighted the white British group again because the other groups are being compared with the likelihood of exclusion by the majority group. And you can see that here, Gypsy Roma students are less likely to be excluded than the white group. And I've talked to people that work with Gypsy Roma community organisations, and they suggest that that might be because of schools not wanting to register Gypsy Roma students as actually on their roll officially. So when they do exclude them, it doesn't show up in the numbers. But as you can see from the other statistics, the groups that achieve less well are also more likely to be excluded from school. Pupils with Black Caribbean heritage are 3 times more likely to be excluded than white British kids. And travellers of Irish heritage are nearly 7 times more likely to be excluded from school than a white peer. Lots of reviews of research done by different researchers with different ethnic origins, funded by different groups. They all point the same way, that teachers across the system tend to hold very negative stereotypes of these groups. And those stereotypes change the way that the groups are dealt with from the day that they enter the education system. And what look like small inequalities on a day-to-day level get bigger and bigger as they move through the system. Most pupils who are excluded in this way never return to full-time mainstream education, and kids that have been excluded are much more likely to be unemployed and to have dealings with the criminal justice system later in life. So you can see from the evidence, numbers, people like numbers. You have lots of interview data, people say that's subjective. Anybody could say that. Numbers, we're told, are powerful and truthful. These numbers are telling a very particular story about an education system that is shaped by racist inequality. Now, what's strange is that these are very recent figures. Policymakers are not talking about race inequality in England anymore. Well, not in this sense. Policymakers in England talk about the problems facing white students. So these are a succession of headlines from national newspapers and TV coverage from 2008 through to this year. And there is a constant chiming the same story: white kids are doing less well. White kids are the worst performing group. White kids. It's about white kids. Let me show you how this message is created just by looking at one newspaper article. This is in a newspaper called the Daily Telegraph, which is a broadsheet. It's meant to be a kind of intellectual paper. Right of centre, as almost all the press is in the UK. Now, at the start of the story, I don't know if this has a pointer. No. At the start of the story, right up at the top, it says British children from poorest homes are being failed at school. Then in the subheading immediately underneath, it says white British pupils from working class homes are more likely to fail at school than any other ethnic group. So between the first sentence and the next sentence, there's a shift. It starts by talking about the poorest, and then it says working class. And working class in England has a very different meaning to the very poorest. But then, if you move to the text below the picture, it says white British pupils perform worse in GCSE exams than classmates from black and Asian backgrounds, according to figures from the Department for Education. Now, I've already shown you that that is not true. I just showed you the latest statistics. White British kids do better on average than several minority ethnic groups, including black children and including Roma children. These are the figures when you include all the kids in those groups. White British kids are nowhere near being the lowest performing group. So what they do for these numbers is to look only at kids who receive free school meals. So this is a benefit for children who live in poverty. They get one meal a day during the school week paid for by the state. Now, if we only look at the kids who get that benefit, the overall pattern changes dramatically. Achievement goes down for all groups when you only look at kids who get free school meals, but it goes down most for white British kids. So suddenly, if you only look at free school meal kids, white kids are doing worse than people with black Caribbean ethnic heritage. They're not doing worse than Gypsy, Roma and Traveller kids. That still contradicts the story, so they just don't get mentioned. Government reports, the headlines, the speeches that are made by policymakers simply ignore the fact that Gypsy, Roma and Traveller students do this badly, even when you only look at the free school meal kids. And the final way in which these headlines are created is this slippage from working class and free school meals. In England, about 60% of the population call themselves working class. And it's been about that level for the last 40 years. But free school meals don't go to anything like 60%. They go to the poorest 14%. So what the statisticians do is to look at data on the poorest 14%, but by using the phrase working class, 60% think you're talking about them and their children. So the underachievement of the poorest is represented as an issue for all working class white people, and then in another little slip, actually all white British children. And if you think I'm exaggerating, this is a quote from the Chief Analyst and Senior Ministerial Policy Advisor at the Department for Education. On the basis of data only about free school meal kids, he said, "Why is it that white kids are doing so much worse? We have to tackle that as a society. for the future of Britain, it obviously matters more to tackle white underperformance just because there are more white people. So, because there are more of them, they're more important. This is now. I mean, it's kind of nonsensical, but this is education policy in England right now. So, I've been talking for about 35 minutes. Let me try and pull this into some kind of a conclusion. I think at the moment we're living at a time of great uncertainty and tremendous danger. Across Europe, the economic crisis that began in 2008 has been stimulating growing resentment, stereotyping, and scapegoating. Racial and ethnic minorities are bearing the brunt of these processes across the continent, especially Roma, black people, and Muslim groups. In this context, human rights protections are more important than ever. In the present climate of stereotyping and abuse, we need greater respect for human rights, not a weakening of protection, and not the assertion of nationalistic identities and prejudices. Human rights are not an inconvenience or a barrier to economic growth. They're an essential first principle for a civilized society. I'm sorry to say that we live at a time when many in mainstream politics and the media see benefit in attacking human rights protections and further stereotyping minority groups. Education has a vital role to play. At present, mainstream education is often part of the problem. In England, all funding for minority education projects has been removed, and teachers are encouraged to prioritise the needs of white kids. As you just saw, official policy, prioritise white kids. But there is hope. Progressive educators continue to fight for race equality in their schools and in their communities. Minority communities themselves continue to work for the best education for their children. And this takes numerous forms. Organising supplementary and community-based schools and education schemes, working as communities to pressurise schools and public authorities to take their rights seriously, and actively resisting the spread of racist material inside schools and in the wider society. Now, we know there are no easy answers. Even well-intentioned teachers can find themselves reinforcing these barriers and actively contributing to the educational underachievement and the exclusion of minority groups. Good intentions are not enough, but we have to actively resist the current xenophobia and racism that increasingly characterises much of European politics. I want to leave the last words to Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave who became an internationally renowned abolitionist. A man who fought for the right to read, the right to be free, dedicated his life to these things. More than 150 years ago, he said some very wise things about the politics of change, and I think they still hold true today. He said, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." And I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for this lecture. It makes us feel that we're not alone in Europe. So I'm sure that we could come up, and we will, with very, very similar examples from our own country. And now there is a question and answer session. And I open the floor.
I had a couple of questions and trying to be brief. So one of it is actually related more to the travels of critical race theory, and what surprises me to some extent is the way of looking at the origins of critical race theory, the sort of legal domain. One thing that surprises me is that in the UK at least, it seems to have landed sort of more in the education domain, and that lawyers are pretty much absent. So that was one of the observations also with the paper that was sent at this kind of trajectory, how it landed in a different place. So for me, part of the interest in looking at critical race theory in the European domain is actually how law contributes to that, and how law contributes to the social construction, which is where critical race theory was born.
We need them to speak into.
So that part, the surprise for me is actually that in the UK, you would expect, which is at least a country that has some sort of race-conscious approach and that shares the same language, that there would be more commonalities with critical race theory. It's much less surprising that on the continent there is very, very little work, neither in education, I guess, but in law for sure. It's a pretty much empty slate. And that gets me to the second question, or comment. Parts of the statistics that you're showing obviously are very, and you said it, numbers are very important. I guess Hungary here as well, the issue is the same as it is in France, as it is in Italy, in Germany. We simply don't have the statistics and we're not allowed to have them. So obviously, which poses a big problem, whether for the education people, for the lawyers, that actually by law these statistics are prohibited. The European Commission is trying to do something about that in nudging countries to adopt statistics. But until we don't have those, it is pretty hard and pretty difficult to adopt some sort of counterbalancing. I mean, it's kind of like, yes, we all know it's probably happening that the same statistics are happening in Italy, in France, in Spain, in Hungary, wherever it is. But until you don't have the hard numbers. So in some ways, you look at the UK like the bonanza. You know, like great, at least you can get the numbers, and at least you can talk race.
Well,
because here, I'm not talking about Europe, but in France, certainly you don't, race is just not off the hook. You don't talk about it. In Germany, the same, because obviously it comes up, the images that you showed about the Holocaust. So those are sort of reflections in terms of translating, even from the United Kingdom to the mainland, some of the differences and difficulties that we are dealing with, and sort of like here, then I'm not talking about the transfer of critical race theory to mainland Europe. So these are sort of reflections and questions.
Well, if I can start with the second one about numbers, I was being facetious when I said numbers are hard and truthful, because they're just as constructed and you lie just as easily with numbers. I mean, if I show a quotation, we're all really good at critiquing qualitative data. So if I show an outrageous quotation, people will immediately say, when did they say that? What were they talking about? What question did you ask them? Whereas 9 out of 10 people, you show them a graph and tell them what it means, and they go, oh, okay. I mean, my first ever book, I quoted a table that had been reprinted at least 30 times. It was the first time in England somebody said they'd got data on achievement by race and class. So everybody reprinted it. And when I put it in my book, to check that I'd copied it correctly, I totted up the columns. And there was a mistake in the table. And the mistake is in every single rendition of the table because nobody checked it. They just copied it out and said, well, this is what it tells us. So I have a big... I'm very angry about statistics and how easy it is to lie with them. However, they are useful because of those very weaknesses in how people interpret them. So I always use numbers when I can because they're not as easily dismissed as qualitative data. Now, ethnic monitoring is not an answer to this stuff. It can be a part of it, can be a tool, it can be a resource, but it can also be massively misused. But I remember speaking in Sweden, and they said, well, what do we do at a school level? And I said, well, the first thing you do is you just count. Where are the minoritized groups? Who's being excluded? Who's failing? Who's in the bottom groups? And they said, well, we're not allowed to do that because, you know, keeping lists, it can be misused. And I mean, I can see the historical resonance of that, But if, you know, a fascist alien were to land outside and come in and say, I need to know who your minoritized students are, if you said, well, we don't keep lists, they wouldn't get in the ship and fly away again. They'd make some lists of their own. So I think it's a kind of, it's a liberal way of washing your hands of the problem. It's very complicated. We don't like the history of keeping lists, so we won't do it. Even though it means that we won't have evidence of where the system is systematically behaving in racist, sexist ways, we don't gather information because we're above that. I think, you know, you have to get your hands dirty. The real world is more complicated. In terms of what you were saying about critical race theory, I specifically didn't talk explicitly about critical race theory in the lecture because we had a workshop this morning, and many people have in their, if they've ever heard of CRT at all, they may have heard a myth about it, that it only looks at race, or it hates white people. Critical race theorists can't stand white people. And yeah, I'd need 2 hours to go through some of that stuff. But in terms of what you were saying about its movement, CRT is now a global movement. I work with people in South Africa, in Australia, in lots of different parts of Europe, in South America, and they're all using critical race theory, and they're all doing it in education. I think the tools that began in American law schools in the 70s and 80s are wonderful insights into how power works. And they work not just for race, they work for gender, I think they work for sexuality. There's a new movement now called disability critical race theory, which uses CRT as a way of taking forward critical understandings of disability. So I think certainly in education, it's been taken by a wide range of people, white people, South Asian people, black people, all using CRT in very creative ways. And maybe that's something to do with how politics and change is defined in the UK rather than in the States. So, you know, in the UK, we don't have a written constitution. Kind of the constitution, the rights are made up on the hoof by courts and commented on by the different houses of parliament and in the media. So there's much more of a kind of discursive construction of what rights look like in the UK, and educators have always been involved in those arguments. That may have something to do with it, I don't know. But there's a body called the Critical Race Studies in Education Association, which is based in the US and which keeps alive the link of educators and legal theorists. So every year at our annual conference, we're addressed by a very prominent legal theorist because we think that that's a real benefit, having that link. It's not something just for the past.
Hello, my name is Maja Nenadovic, and I'd like to ask you a question and kind of bully you into agreeing with me. I will agree with you that we cannot dismantle race by ignoring the concept and by not using the language. It's very difficult. But I'd like to invite you to contemplate the possibility of abandoning the human rights framework for two reasons. I believe that the human rights framework and human rights education, the way it has been implemented in the last few decades, has given more harms than benefits, precisely because it has focused too much on rights and not at all on responsibilities, duties, and obligations that accompany those rights. So in that sense, I believe that human rights education has bred a lot of entitlement. And this is why we have the example today that human rights discourse is hijacked by right-wing groups who are demanding their right to protest, who are demanding their right to be speaking freely, even though what they're effectively doing is using hate speech. And the second reason why I would like you to consider abandoning the human rights framework, at least for the time being, is because it's laden with paradoxes. How is it that we promote human rights when, in order to have any rights respected, you're not supposed to be human, you're in fact just supposed to be a citizen of a given state? What rights do refugees have? What rights do immigrants have? What rights do stateless people have? They are human, but the states that are supposed to protect them and guarantee those rights have given up on that, whether because they are in conflict or because these individuals have been deemed unwanted. So I guess my question to you is, if we don't have human rights framework to rely on, what could stand in its place? Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think this relates to something we were talking about this morning in the workshop, where I think there's a tendency for those of us that are passionate about bringing change, that we beat ourselves up about why we haven't got there yet. You know, I've been doing this for 20 years. Come on, why is racism still around? What did I get wrong? It wasn't that we were too stupid to come up with a better framework, or that there was a great answer there all the time, but we just couldn't find it. Racism is that complicated. Whatever we do, racism will react. Usually before we finish the sentence, they're already working out how to take apart what we think we've just achieved. So there's a great concept in critical race theory called the contradiction closing case, which looks at how massive civil rights victories, the things that we all see as the moment where a society moved forward, are actually the moment where the status quo keeps itself safe. So a contradiction between the reality of racism and the story the nation tells about itself becomes so great that something has to happen. So you have a big act of parliament, or you have a big celebration. You say, we've changed, we've desegregated education, we've made schools responsible for race equality. You've closed the contradiction, and on the ground, nothing happens. So I would argue that human rights instruments are a basic start. They're not perfect. They can be misused to the kinds of ends that you were saying, as almost any instrument can be. But I think rather than saying, oh, they haven't worked, throw them out, I think what we need to do is work to ensure that the way in which they're practiced doesn't leave loopholes, doesn't rely on a minimalist, sneering definition that's dragged out of you, but actually starts to celebrate the spirit that created them in the first place. I hardly ever refer to the Holocaust. I've been doing anti-racist work for about 30 years. I hardly ever refer to it. But I think actually things in Europe are getting to a stage where we need to start referring to it, not as a terrible lapse of history, but as a sign of what we are capable of. It's not about one nation. That's what human beings will do to other human beings, given the right circumstances. So I think we need to actually get better at human rights rather than throwing out the instruments and trying to start from scratch. David Cameron, who I don't know if you worked out, I'm not a fan of David Cameron. He goes on the world stage and says, you know, we've got to hold countries accountable for human rights. He's a big fan of human rights in other countries, but in England, they're a pain and he wants to step back from those things. So.
Hello. Good evening. I'm Marius Taba. I'm Roma myself from Romania, and I'm taking the opportunity to thank Professor David Gillborn, because this spring an article of a bunch of guys, and I think some of them you met this morning, Julius Rostash, Andrew Ryder, and myself, appears in your journal, and the title of the article is Nothing About Us Without Us: The Role of Inclusive Community Development in School Desegregation for Roma Communities. So I would like to ask you about the complexity of the institutionalization of racism. And I think that aside of the political arena and the so-called politics of the goatscape that it's used at the European level and at the country level, I think that we have to analyze that in the countries where we have parties like Jobbik here, Ataka in Bulgaria, or in another country, the racism is manifest. Yeah. But there are analytical work showing that in a country like Romania, this kind of parties, they don't have ground to develop because the racism, it's embedded in a mainstream political agenda. Right. And then the place it's booked already for the targeted measures. Second point that I wanted to raise with you and to have your opinion is the so-called sophisticated mechanism. And here I will touch upon a little bit on numbers, codes, and I think we have to look how credible are these kind of sources of information, both for numbers and codes. And for some time, I'm debating with my friends that this kind of institutionalized racism is here in academia. Oh. And believe me, it's very sophisticated. Yep. I wanted to raise just the point of knowledge production into the academia. So if a Roma scholar is coming with a statement, automatically it's criticized as being subjective. Yep. If a scholar is making a racist statement, and we had 2 years ago Professor Jasenski saying about Roma that they are animals, from the level of his seniority and scholarity, people are better influenced than Mario Staba speaking at the level of just being a PhD. Yeah. So university and the so-called institutions for knowledge production, they already develop some very sophisticated mechanisms for promoting racist idea. Yeah. And I want to hear your opinion. Well, thank you very much.
I agree completely. On the point about racism in the kind of political mainstream, I don't know enough about other states to say whether the absence of an extreme right wing actually just denotes that they've already taken power. I don't know. What I do know is that in the European states that I have some knowledge of, mainstream politics is lurching further and further to the right all the time. And that certainly in the UK, the appearance of far-right parties has been used as an excuse by the mainstream parties to move further to the right. Rather than face up to racism and name it, there's now a competition to get the votes that the racist parties are winning. And it's actually quite disgusting. You mentioned about the idea of institutional racism in the academy. I think universities are one of the most elitist, closed, self-obsessed, racist, sexist, disableist organizations you could ever invent. Because they pride themselves on how clever they are, on what a meritocracy they are. And that gives them the perfect reason to not worry about the absence of female professors, of black professors, of Roma professors, because, you know, if they were clever enough and worked hard enough, we'd recruit them. I've been told this around the world. What I would point to as a way of breaking into this, and what you say about, you know, being a Roma scholar, talking on these issues, oh, you get discounted. You can't be objective. This goes right back to the beginnings of critical race theory, where people like Derek Bell, Richard Delgado, highlight the fact that in a race-sensitive case, the white lawyers would argue that we can't have an African-American judge because they won't be able to be impartial. So who can be impartial on a race case? Well, a white person. Because white people, we don't have a race. We're just normal human beings. Race and ethnicity is something for exotic other people. The very best statement of this is a chapter by Derek Bell in a book called Faces at the Bottom of the Well. And it's the first thing that I give to students when I introduce them to critical race theory. What Bell does is basically to say how we are judged as humans based on how our own ethnicity is judged and whether we're supporting or critiquing the racial status quo. So a member of an oppressed group arguing against the oppression is discounted. You would say that. It's just special pleading. Whereas if you as a Roma say, you know what, all this rubbish about institutional racism, the problem is my community just don't work hard enough. You will find yourself on the front page of newspapers. You'll be having dinner with major politicians. There'll be funding groups in the US who want to give you some research money. People are promoted fast. And as Derek Bell said, it's amazing that there aren't more members of the oppressed group who take that way out. There are members of every oppressed group who take that way out, and some of them may genuinely believe that the problem is their community, not the system. But the rules of racial standing is incredibly difficult reading for everyone because, I mean, it points out the reason. My research centre, the Centre for Research in Race and Education, the only university-based centre looking at racism in education in England. How is that possible? How is it possible that in England there's only one centre in a university looking at that? Well, because the system has decided that it's not important. And who runs that centre? A white guy. You know, I mean, I can say stuff as a white anti-racist, I would say I'm a critical race theorist. I can say stuff that if one of my black colleagues said it, would be discounted as manic ravings. My last book talks about racism as a form of conspiracy. Not a simple Hollywood conspiracy, but the kind of complex conspiracy that happens between multinationals, where decisions always favour a certain group and work against another group. In law, that's prima facie evidence of a conspiracy. And if you think about racism as operating like that, it also enables you to start to say, whatever we do, whether it's human rights or some other framework, whatever we do, the conspiracy will try and take it apart. So if we know it's operated as if it were a conspiracy in the past, we can try and anticipate what it will do in the future. Now, I can say it's a conspiracy, and the book gets published, and I'm a professor. I don't think I'd get away with that if I was a black man, because a black man in the British Academy is an endangered species. There are very few of them, and the ones that are there are viewed with enormous suspicion. So I absolutely, that was a really long answer, but the answer was yes, definitely.
You put me in a rather awkward position of having to agree with David Cameron, which is something I do not do gladly. I think there's a certain bias in what you're saying, at least to some extent, in that I think that to some extent there is an element of oversimplification, in the sense that it doesn't have to be either or. It doesn't have to be the education system is racist or there's a problem with the group. It can be both at the same time. And when you interpret the numbers concerning why so few Roma are able to finish college properly and are accepted in college, while I do agree, and there's no doubt, I think in anybody's mind here, that there is a certain racial bias in the education system, you completely skip mentioning any of the problems those communities face within themselves that lead also to their education problems. As a person who has worked with Roma in Croatia, who has worked with these groups in order to help them integrate, I can definitely tell you that while there is a huge bias in both the law system, both in the political system and in the education system, there are realistic problems within these communities that also prevent the Roma Roma from integrating into the education system and into society in general. Just to name some, in many communities, parents do not consider that education is important for their children. They do not consider it a valid goal. Furthermore, they consider that the wider society is racist and biased against them, which to a large extent is true, and therefore there's no even point in trying to integrate into a society that hates them. Furthermore, Roma minority members sometimes in some communities, I'm not saying all, but once they become educated, once they come back into the community, they are rejected because they are no longer perceived as Roma, because a significant portion of their societies considers somebody who is educated and somebody who has participated in the outside world as now being an intruder and being a foreign entity when they come back. They consider this person no longer to be Roma. And since you are probably aware of these issues yourself, I think when presenting these things, it is also important to emphasize them, because if they are left unemphasized, then we really get this feeling of you're saying white people bad, minorities good. And that, I think, is what gives right-wing parties the strength that they get. That they can also say, well, we may be questionable, but look at the lefties, look at the human rights people. They are also biased. They only see one side of the picture. And I think a large part of being stronger and more vocal and more persuasive than the right is being straight up with all the elements and all the factors that are considered here. I have no doubt that educational bias is a large contributor to the numbers that you were showing, but it is not the only one, and yet it is the only one you talked about.
Yeah, no, it's the only one that I talk about because everyone talks about all the other things all the time. I gave a paper, one of the papers I'm proudest of having been asked to give was in a US law school. Richard Delgado organized an equity colloquium at Wake Forest Law School, and I was the only non-lawyer that was presenting. And I gave a paper about the impossibility of stereotyping white people. And I invited people to, I put up a newspaper headline, a fake newspaper headline saying, most dangerous group in the country. And there was a picture of an African-American youth with a hood, and people were like, well, yeah, we've seen that all the time. And then I said, well, what about, is this a possible headline? And there's a picture of a nice white guy in a suit, and I think he had a tie on, and it said, the most dangerous man in America, white middle-class male. And people laughed. That's ridiculous. And I said, well, yeah, but the defense for showing black men in hoods as a dangerous thing, they use criminal statistics. Well, all the big serial killers are college-educated white men. Now, if they weren't white, we could argue that actually, rather than trying to have big databases of DNA for crimes, why don't we just take a DNA sample from every white man with a college degree? Because actually, that's the demographic that are most likely to be serial killers. And it's laughable. It would never happen. You can't, because you're violating the human rights of a very important group. But all of the arguments about, well, you're stereotyping a group, the group is more complex than that, all those arguments disappear when people say, ah, yes, but a lot of street crime is perpetrated by the groups that you defend, Dave. You can't get away from that. Certain aspects of the real world become a basis for a stereotype, and certain aspects remain the strange behavior of individuals. And what decides that is how it fits within stereotypes. So I'm constantly told about a problem with, supposed problem with Muslim communities not supporting their daughters through education as much as they would support sons. And no matter how many examples you give against that, this is a powerful stereotype. And what people forget is that it's only relatively recently that women were allowed to go to Oxford and Cambridge University, that many very elite white families were never interested in educating their women. And yet, white elites aren't viewed as the kind of terrible, sexist, oppressive home that South Asian families in the UK are viewed as. So I'm not I'm not denying the variability of every human group, that there are saints and sinners in every group. But when we want to challenge the inequalities of the kind that I've highlighted, some people will want to argue that it comes from a deficit in the community itself, and they will have every deficit under the sun before they will consider a problem with the majority. They'll start with upbringing, single-parent families, what kind of work they do, their own education. They'll talk about diet. They'll try and reinvent IQ and intelligence, even though that was demonstrably bull decades ago. And right-wing foundations pour millions into supporting that pseudo-scientific work right as we speak. So my argument is that these debates are about power. And in the real world, when we have the arguments, certain groups are defined as deficit and certain groups are assumed to be free of those deficits. My argument is that actually if we recognize the variability and the richness and the problems in every human group, we can then stand back and say, actually, what is it that we can do about this? I mean, this is quite a rambling answer. I often go into a school and people will say, well, yeah, but it's not us. We try really hard. We just can't get this group of pupils to do something. And I say, well, look, if you think it's their culture that's the problem, I think it's the culture of the school that's the problem, which can we change? We can't, you know, I'll talk to a racist and the racist and I will agree, we can't change the culture of the group we're talking about, so let's change the way the school behaves. Let's try and make it serve all of the students. And race equality is not a zero-sum game. If you have greater social justice for minority groups, that does not detract from the social justice of the majority. What it detracts from are the unearned privileges and abuses that the majority currently benefit from.
Within the European context, there's a new wave of policy documents coming up with diversity management schemes, both in public education and other kinds of government activities. What do you think about those in relationship to your other frameworks, especially racism and human rights education?
Right, so diversity is a nice, cuddly, friendly word, whereas race and anti-racism are seen as nasty, aggressive words that hurt people. If you can do real, good, critical work under a diversity banner, that's absolutely fine. In my experience, many diversity schemes, certainly in the UK, are very much about the deficit analysis. How can we help these people to fit into the pre-existing system? And very often diversity in the UK means gender. So a university will say, we're really keen on diversity, and you'll go to the diversity conference and there'll be 3 speakers about gender. There'll be nobody about disability, there'll be nobody about sexuality, there'll be nobody about race. And my argument is not, let's stop talking about gender. My argument would be, let's start talking about how these different inequalities intersect. So it's great that all the universities in the UK have signed up to a diversity scheme to try and improve the number of women academics in senior positions. But they need to sign up to getting women academics in senior positions who aren't white and don't come from a middle class background and maybe have visible disabilities, because those people are part of the population too. So I think diversity can be a start, but it has, rather than being a kind of code word for not doing very much, I think it ought to be a kind of means of opening the door to really look at intersections of those different issues and oppressions.
Thank you very much.